All right, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to today's laboratory practical session. I'm incredibly excited to walk you through this explainer because we're going to investigate one of the most fascinating and honestly somewhat unnerving concepts in all of cognitive psychology. For the next few minutes, we're basically stepping into the shoes of experimental psychologists to examine the actual architecture of human memory. We're looking specifically at a phenomenon called the effect of schema on memory. Now, we usually trust our memories implicitly, right? But as you'll see in our lab setup today, the way we store and recall our past is way more complex than just hitting play on a recording. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the experiment, I want you to think about a real-world puzzle. Why do we remember the exact same event differently? Imagine two people witness a minor traffic collision on a busy street. A week goes by, and they're asked to describe what happened. One remembers a car speeding recklessly, while the other swears it was moving slowly but just swerved out of nowhere. Did one of them simply forget? Are they making a deliberate mistake? Or, and this is exactly what we're testing today, did their existing knowledge, beliefs, and expectations actively alter what they remembered? That is the exact mystery that cognitive schema research tries to solve. To figure this out, here's our laboratory protocol for today. We'll start by unpacking the reconstructive memory puzzle, then break down what mental frameworks actually are. From there, we'll run through the schema laboratory experiment itself, analyze our findings, look at how this applies to the real world, and wrap up with our key takeaways. Okay, let's start with phase 1, the reconstructive memory puzzle. For the longest time, pop culture has treated human memory like a video camera. Like it's this perfectly objective recording of events that you can just rewind and play back at will. But cognitive psychology has proven that memory fundamentally isn't a reproductive process. It's actually a reconstructive one. When you recall an event, you aren't pulling up a flawless digital file. You're piecing together fragments of information on the fly. And to fill in the missing gaps, your brain uses your previous knowledge, your cultural background, and your expectations. It's an active assembly process happening in real time, every single time you remember something. It's a massive paradigm shift. We aren't just retrieving a past reality, we are actively rebuilding it. Moving into our second section, let's understand mental frameworks. If memory is a puzzle that we're constantly reconstructing, what exactly is the blueprint we use to put those pieces together? Well, that blueprint is what we call a schema. A schema is essentially an organized mental framework developed through your own experiences that helps you interpret new and unfamiliar information. Think of it as a cognitive shortcut. We build these schemas our entire lives through our education, our culture, our language, and just repeatedly being in similar situations. Let's say you walk into a restaurant you've never been to before. You already know you should probably wait for a host, sit down, and look at a menu, right? That is your restaurant schema at work. It lets us process information incredibly efficiently and understand unfamiliar situations in a snap. But as our experiment will show, this amazing efficiency comes at a real cost to absolute accuracy. Which brings us to part 3, the schema laboratory experiment. How do cognitive psychologists actually isolate and test this invisible mental framework in a strictly controlled lab setting? Let's check out the methodology. The most crucial part of any experiment is how we control and measure our variables. Our independent variable, which is the thing we're manipulating, is the type of information presented. Is it schema consistent, meaning it fits perfectly into what the participant already knows? Or is it schema inconsistent, meaning it's totally unfamiliar or contradicts their expectations? Our dependent variable, the thing we're measuring, is the accuracy and the completeness of their recall. And of course, to maintain scientific rigor, our controlled variables mean we keep the presentation time, the testing environment, the recall interval, and the material difficulty exactly the same for everyone. This is how we isolate the precise cognitive mechanism we want to observe. Now imagine you're sitting right here at the lab bench. Here is the exact procedure we follow. First, we explain the task to the participant, but we intentionally don't reveal the true objective of the experiment, just to prevent any bias. Second, we present them with some meaningful information, like a story or a picture, for a very specific duration. Third, we abruptly take the material away. Fourth, after a set amount of time, we ask them to recall as much information as possible. Fifth, we record every single response exactly as they reported. And finally, step 6, we meticulously compare their recalled data with the original material. We're looking for correctly recalled details, omitted information, and most importantly, schema-based additions. Now, I want you to take a second and predict what happens to the details that just don't fit into the participant's normal worldview. All right, section 4, analyzing the experimental findings. Let's see if your predictions were on the money. When we look at the data, a very clear pattern emerges that brilliantly illustrates this whole phenomenon.
Notice how high the recall is for general meaning and familiar concepts. Participants almost always successfully remember the broad strokes of the material, especially when that information perfectly aligns with their existing schemas. But then look at the drastic drop-off for unfamiliar details. Information that is inconsistent with what a participant already knows is recalled terribly. And honestly, what's even more fascinating is what we don't see immediately. When participants forget those unfamiliar details, they routinely simplify them, alter them, or entirely replace them with familiar concepts that make sense to them. And they are completely unaware that they're doing it.
So, how do we interpret these results? Well, the findings confirm that memory is definitely not a passive storage drive. It is a highly active, reconstructive process. Your existing knowledge organizes incoming information, and this happens both during the encoding phase, when you first learn the information, and during the retrieval phase, when you're trying to remember it. The ultimate takeaway here is kind of a double-edged sword. Schemas drastically improve our ability to understand the world rapidly, but they introduce significant distortions and inaccuracies during recall. We literally rewrite our own memories just to make them fit what we believe should be true.
Let's transition into Section 5, Real-World Applications, because this is far more than just some fascinating laboratory trick.
Let's look at how this plays out in education. Understanding schemas is literally a superpower for learning. If an educator can activate a learner's prior knowledge, their existing schema, before introducing a new complex concept, it radically improves reading comprehension and concept formation. By linking new, unfamiliar details to a familiar mental framework, teachers can heavily enhance classroom instruction and promote much stronger long-term retention. We use schemas to anchor new knowledge, effectively turning abstract facts into relatable understanding. But the clinical and legal applications are really where this research becomes absolutely critical. Remember our opening question about the eyewitnesses? Schema research proves that eyewitness testimony is inherently vulnerable to distortion. The justice system has to account for the fact that a witness isn't necessarily lying. Their schema just aggressively reconstructed the memory to make logical sense of the chaos. Furthermore, in clinical psychology, understanding schemas is totally foundational for things like cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, where therapists help patients identify and reshape negative mental frameworks. It's also vital for cognitive rehabilitation, neuropsychological assessments, and evaluating memory disorders. Our entire clinical approach relies heavily on understanding how people process, distort, and retrieve their reality. And that brings us to Section 6, our key takeaways for today. To summarize our protocol, our objective was successfully met. We proved that schemas heavily influence memory performance. The underlying psychological principle we validated is that memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. Our findings clearly demonstrated that our prior knowledge actively alters both how we encode and how we retrieve information. The scientific significance of this is massive. While schemas give us cognitive efficiency, they're the direct cause of memory distortions. Ultimately, these concepts are absolutely essential across cognitive psychology, modern education, and clinical practice. I want to leave you with this final, rather provocative thought summarizing our explainer today. Memory is not a perfect recording. It is a reconstruction shaped by what we already know. So the next time to find yourself absolutely certain of exactly how an event unfolded, take a moment and ask yourself, are you remembering the exact objective truth, or are you just remembering a story that perfectly fits your schema? Thank you so much for joining me in the lab today. Keep questioning, keep observing, and I'll see you in the next explainer.